We are so excited to have you here today. For those of you who would like to turn on closed captionings, you'll have an option on the bottom of your screen. It should say live transcript. That should give you access to the captions today. My name is Mary Hopkins. I'm the Sexual Violence Prevention Program Director with the Minnesota Department of Health. And I am so excited to be here today co-hosting this meeting of the Sexual Violence Prevention Network. Co-hosting with me today is Julia Tyndall.
Hello, everybody. My name is Julia. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the Minnesota Department of Health Sexual Violence Prevention Program Planner, and also incredibly thrilled to be here.
Also on our planning team, we always like to give a shout out to, we have Hunter Beckstrom and Jude Foster from the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Hunter is behind the MNCASA tech support name today. If you have any issues, you can chat him. And Marissa Regay is also joining us today. She is our data and evaluation coordinator at the Minnesota Department of Health. So for those of you who might be new to our meeting this morning, we host 4 of these meetings each year. Recently, of course, they've all been virtual meetings. And we really have 3 goals that we're trying to get out of this network. First and foremost, we want to build the understanding for primary prevention of sexual violence. And by primary prevention, I'm talking about those proactive steps that we can take to prevent violence before it ever happens. And the most effective prevention solutions create a culture that doesn't tolerate violence of any kind. And culture is constantly changing all around us, and we can change it for the better by changing policies, practices, and the environments where we live, learn, work, and play. So we bring all sorts of different topics to these meetings to have conversations about sexual violence, and we always tie it back to prevention.
Absolutely. And of course, this does not mean that we forget about victims and survivors. At the center of all of our work are the voices and needs of victims and survivors, whether we are doing direct services, systems change, or prevention. All of these pieces are equally important in our work, and all levels need to exist to move change forward while still supporting those most impacted by sexual violence. Our second goal is to share resources related to sexual violence prevention. We will be sharing resources during our meeting today, and we'll also share resources, events, and updates on the SVPN mailing list, which goes out every 2 weeks. The Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or MNCASA, also shares prevention resources on the MNCASA prevention email list. We also encourage you to sign up for updates from Prevent Connect to stay connected to what is happening nationally. Previous presentations that have been archived can be seen on the MNCASA's website to access following our meetings. And as always, our presentations, I already said this, our presentations are recorded and archived on the MNCASA website for you to watch again and to share with your colleagues.
Thank you, Julia. And then our third goal is all about connections. And so connections looks a little different these days, but we do hope that you'll use this meeting to reach out to someone new, maybe make a new contact. Maybe you see a name on that participant list that you've been meaning to reach out to, and here's a great excuse to make that connection. So to start that off, we do invite everyone, if you have not already, to share in the chat your name, your pronouns, where you're joining us from, and one word to describe how you're feeling today. And I will share, I am feeling a little distracted today. I don't know anyone else. I had some weather-related issues over the last 24 hours, but I have been looking forward to this SVPN meeting since we first reached out to Gender Justice. So I'm excited to have an opportunity to really focus on this meeting for the next hour and a half and leave my weather issues for until 90 minutes from now.
Oh, thanks, Mary. Yeah, I think if I were to put a word on it, I think I'm just, I'm tired. I'm sure a lot of us are tired. Yeah, I'm a little, but I'm tired like in my body, but I'm super energized to be here and energized to see all of the people who are joining us today and to get to meet Christy and hear about Gender Justice's work. So, you know, kind of towing the line there between feeling tired, but also feeling jazzed. And it looks like we've got, you know, a variety of responses in the chat from people feeling happy about the warm weather and feeling hectic, feeling good and feeling dreary, feeling grateful and feeling overwhelmed. You know, we've got it kind of across the spectrum today for the feelings that we're bringing into this space. And so I just want to say, you know, take care of yourselves. Let's all like take a drink of water and do what we need to take care. And I'm also definitely looking forward to just being present in this hour. And thank you to all of you for sharing a bit about yourselves. Like Mary said, we really hope that you'll use today as an opportunity to meet some new people and make some great connections. So before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping requests for everyone today. First, please keep yourself on mute unless you are speaking. There is a raise your hand feature on Zoom. So if we have multiple people wanting to share, we might ask that you use this option, and then we'll call on you to unmute yourself at the time that you're able. You are also welcome to share through the chat if you would prefer, and we will keep an eye on that. So, and now I have the absolute privilege of inviting Christy, introducing Christy, who will be speaking with us about resources and advocacy tools to support transgender students and their families. Christy is the senior staff attorney at Gender Justice, where she represents clients challenging gender discrimination. She practices in both state and federal court and has argued before the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals and the Minnesota Court of Appeals. Christy litigates cases involving discrimination in employment, housing, healthcare, and education. She is proud of her groundbreaking work on transgender rights in the Affordable Care Act and the Minnesota Human Rights Act. She has a particular interest in representing clients who have experienced trauma. Christy graduated magna cum laude from the University of Minnesota Law School and joined Gender Justice in 2011 as a Robina Public Interest Scholars Fellow. Prior to becoming an attorney, Christy worked as a computer programmer. And after all that, she's probably one of the coolest people I've ever had the pleasure to introduce. So I hope you'll please join me in welcoming Christy. Take it away.
Thank you so much. I am excited to be here. So yeah, as you have all heard, my name is Christy. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the senior staff attorney at Gender Justice. And I want to tell you a little bit about Gender Justice, and then I want to give you some background information on transgender youth and sexual violence or bullying in schools. We'll talk about what Gender Justice is seeing from people who contact us, what some of the legal frameworks are that we use to assist people, and some resources that are available. So Gender Justice is a relatively young organization founded in 2010, and we are a legal advocacy organization located in St. Paul. We work in Minnesota specifically, and we work to prevent all forms of gender discrimination using the law as a tool. And we do both litigation or suing people. We also advocate at the legislature and in front of agencies, government agencies. And we also do our work through communications and education. So, and my role is primarily as a litigator. And I'll tell you a little bit about a couple of my cases that are relevant as we get to that point. But then I also, do kind of education and let you all know about what's going on. And yeah, so Gender Justice, we address all forms of gender discrimination. So that ranges from, like right now, I'd say I have cases involving sexual assault in a college setting. I have a case involving discrimination for a nursing parent who was detained in a hospital. I have cases involving transgender rights in healthcare, in education, and in sports. And yeah, just the entire range of various forms of gender discrimination. And just to give you, since we're here talking about education specifically, and then we're talking about transgender rights and education, I just wanted to go over kind of a little bit of background information on that. And so, as you are likely well aware, the issue of transgender students in school and transgender children's access to healthcare has been in the news a lot lately. And when we talk about transgender youth, I don't want to just talk about people who identify in a binary part of the spectrum. I want to include both people who identify as a transgender boy or transgender girl, or people who identify as non-binary, gender queer, gender fluid, all of these kinds of terms that, let me tell you, the youth of today are far more familiar with than we are. These are very common terms that they all know how to define. But essentially, these are just different ways of identifying your gender expression, your gender presentation, your gender identity, and things like that. And I recently had the pleasure of presenting to a group of middle school students who identify as transgender, non-binary, genderqueer, or as LGB, lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual. And they are vibrant in how they're expressing their gender and how they're expressing who they are and who they want to be. And they want to be treated with respect, and are advocating forcefully for themselves at school. And we have heard a lot about what they're going through at school. So, and I just want to talk a little bit about some statistics about this, about transgender youth these days. And I'm sure you're all very familiar. I mean, we have great statistics, obviously, from the Minnesota Department of Health and the student survey, right? That talk to us about the number of people, number of students who are identifying as LGBTQ in schools. And this is relatively new data, but it does show that there is a small but growing percentage of young people who are identifying this way, and that they are located all across the state. So not just the metro area, but in every county and every place where education is offered in the state. And we also know that these students are at a particularly high risk for bullying and for negative mental health outcomes. And those seem to be linked. One absolutely great resource that I'm going to refer to a couple of times now is the Trevor Project. So the Trevor Project is a counseling hotline that is available for LGBTQ youth to call, and they do suicide prevention. They connect people with resources and mental health resources and the like. And they do a survey, a national survey on LGBTQ youth mental health. The most recent survey results are from 2021. And I'm gonna see if I can put into the chat here where this is, so that you can take a look at this. This is really amazing data. that they have collected about LGBTQ youth. And I want to point to a couple of different things. In particular, the percentage of people who identify as transgender and the suicide risk there. So one of the most effective, actually, suicide prevention things that I have seen comes from these statistics. So if you look through this and it shows that one of the questions that they ask transgender people is, if you live with other people, how many of them respect your pronouns? And and 29% of the survey respondents said, all of the people I live with respect my pronouns. 22% said some of the people I live with respect my pronouns. And 49% said none of the people that I live with respect my pronouns. And then they matched that with the transgender and non-binary youth who had attempted suicide in the past year. And of the people who said none of the people I live with respect my pronouns, 24% had attempted suicide in the past year. And of the people who said all of the people I live with respect my pronouns, 13% had attempted suicide within the past year. And it's as simple as being treated with respect using the pronouns that they prefer. And, you know, in addition, obviously, there are lots of mental health challenges for LGBTQ youth. Surveys show that when transgender youth are affirmed at home and at school, all of these risks go down. So they very much appear to be associated with discrimination and bullying, either at home or at school or in other environments that they exist in. And I want to, so in most times you see this frame for LGBTQ youth, often it gets put into the category of bullying rather than sexual violence. But that is definitely, those things are kind of, in my mind, identical. They're inextricably linked because they are being bullied for a sex/gender linked characteristic. And a lot of times, you know, if you see, so let's say, you know, I've also represented adults who experience sexual harassment in the workplace. And a lot of times the sexual harassment that they experience in the workplace is basically an attempt to punish them for being in, like often in a male dominated workplace. Women who come into that workplace are sexually harassed because it is an attempt to basically say, you don't belong here. And the bullying that LGBTQ students experience in school is very similar. You don't belong here, you shouldn't exist, you shouldn't be like what you are. You need to be penalized, you need to be punished so that you go back into, you know, the box that, you know, you have been assigned to. And so this, to my mind, these things are one and the same. So I think it's important to, you know, like, yes, this is bullying, but let's not, you know, a lot of times when you say bullying, everybody says, oh, well, I was, you know, everybody gets bullied in middle school or whatever, but that's not what's going on here. These children are being targeted essentially for their gender identity and their gender expression. And yeah, and it's creating an extremely high risk of mental health problems and suicide. So, and there's a lot of misinformation about what it means to be like a young transgender person. So I want to talk to you about, usually, you know, if a student is in an affirming family, what that means for them. So in most cases, It simply means that you respect the pronouns that they want to use and you let them dress how they want to dress. That's basically all of it, especially for the youngest children. Then sometimes when transgender or non-binary students start to approach puberty, some of them experience mental distress from puberty itself. And in that case, they may be prescribed by their doctor after a lengthy screening process. They may be prescribed puberty blockers. And these are absolutely reversible. They are prescribed for other things as well, like somebody who has painful menstruation. And they just put puberty, essentially, they delay it. They put it on hold while, to remove the distress that is associated with going through puberty. In the American Medical Association and the WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, do not recommend and do not, and providers do not provide genital surgery on minors. That simply doesn't happen. In some cases, for 17 and 18-year-old transgender men, they may undergo a mastectomy if and only if they are experiencing severe mental distress from having breasts. So, and there's a lot of fear mongering around this topic, saying that children are being experimented on and being given experimental, drugs and irreversible, fertility altering things. And that is simply not the case. In fact, for the vast majority of transgender and non-binary kids, literally the only thing that they are asking for is to be permitted to be themselves, for people to use the pronouns they say to use, and for people to let them dress how they want to dress. And so I want to talk then specifically about and by the way, I should have said this earlier, but I am happy to answer questions at any time. So if something comes up and you want to just throw it in the chat, I'm keeping an eye on the chat, and happy to do a interactive back and forth. That's always useful, and I enjoy that. So I next want to talk a little bit about what gender justice is seeing. And as some background, so a few years back, gender justice, me specifically, my colleagues, brought a lawsuit on behalf of a transgender boy who was referenced in the lawsuit with the initials NH. And he was on the boys swim team at Coon Rapids High School in the Anoka-Hennepin district. And NH was being accepted by his peers. He was happy on the boys swim team and was not experiencing bullying from the students. But when at some point, some administrators learned that he was a transgender boy and he was on the boys swim team, they decided that that wouldn't be permitted anymore. And initially tried to throw him off the boys swim team close to the end of the swim season, but it was only a few more weeks, and so they relented and let him participate in those last few meets, and then over the summer remodeled the bathrooms and the locker rooms, or excuse me, specifically the locker room, to create a separate single stall locker room. And then they told him he had to use that locker room. He did not want to use that locker room. He wanted to use the locker room with his teammates. He didn't feel safer in the single stall locker room. He felt like, you know, if I'm in here alone, if somebody wants to harm me, it'll be easier than if I'm, you know, surrounded by my teammates. I don't want to do that. And was told by the administration that if he did use the boys' locker room, that there would be disciplinary consequences, and he was required to use the segregated locker room. And he ended up, as in most of the cases that I've experienced involving discrimination in school, he ended up leaving the school and went to an alternative school and experienced a number of really significant mental health consequences as a result. And so we brought this lawsuit against the Anoka-Hennepin School District under the Minnesota Human Rights Act, which is a civil rights law in the state of Minnesota that prohibits discrimination on a number of different bases, including, you know, public accommodations and employment, et cetera. But it also prohibits sex discrimination, gender identity discrimination, sexual orientation discrimination in schools, in educational settings, very broadly, in any type of educational setting. And so we sued the Anoka-Hennepin School District saying, you know, this policy of requiring transgender students to use segregated locker rooms when they do not want to violates both the Minnesota Human Rights Act and violates the Minnesota Constitution. And the Court of Appeals, in a decision issued in, I think, September of 2020, said, that's absolutely right. This does violate the Minnesota Human Rights Act. It does violate the Minnesota Constitution. Schools are required to permit students to use the locker rooms and bathrooms that align with their gender identity in the state of Minnesota. And so that was a case of first impression in Minnesota courts, and that has been in place ever since. Many school districts are aware of it. Perhaps not all school districts are aware that that is the law under Minnesota law. You know, for the timing there, in September of 2020, obviously we were right at the beginning of this pandemic. I mean, not right, we were several months into the pandemic, but we were really into the first brand new school year where students were going to school remotely. And so a lot of schools during that 2020 to 2021 school year did not have to grapple with this issue of what bathrooms and locker rooms their students could use. And then when schools started going back in person in the fall of 2021, we started getting a flood of calls from students all over the state. And we put together some resources because we are a small nonprofit. There are, we have 2 full-time, attorneys on staff, me and the legal director. That's it. We do a lot of work on a lot of different kinds of cases. There's no way that we could assist everybody who gave us a call. So, we tried to refer out the most serious cases to other attorneys, and we made some, self-advocacy tools available on our website, a letter that, parents and students could point to saying, look, this is my legal rights. You have to respect this. I want to tell you a little bit about the different kinds of calls we were receiving. And there's kind of a spectrum, but they all share similar features. So The vast majority of cases that we were getting calls about were from middle school, not from high school. They were from middle school. We also, at the same time as we did that, the NH case did involve a high schooler, but we also represented a middle schooler from a different district in an essentially identical case that was then resolved after the Court of Appeals decision came out, because that was the precedent. And if you look back at the Trevor Project survey, that's one thing that jumps out to me there as well. These LGBTQ youth who are experiencing the most bullying are in middle school, not in high school. So it's really important to realize that middle schools, who probably have not had to deal with a ton of, probably haven't had to deal with as much sexual harassment as the high schools, though I don't know. I can't tell you those statistics, but that they need to understand their obligations under the Minnesota Human Rights Act, and they need to create a safe environment for these students that early. And a lot of these schools are simply unaware of what the law requires them to do and how to create a safe environment for these students. At least, that's what we're hearing. And we're hearing from school districts all over the state. We're hearing not just from school districts where the administration is hostile to LGBTQ students. We are also hearing from school districts where the administrations are actively supportive of LGBTQ students. And if you look again at the Trevor Project survey data on this as well, that is the case. It is certainly the case that there is more bullying in non-affirming schools. The statistics clearly show that on their site, but it is not the case that there's no. It's interesting to me actually that the people at home use the correct pronoun seems to be like the most dramatic intervention that can be made with respect to suicide risk. And affirming schools does lower the suicide risk, but not as much as simply, families using the correct pronouns. So yeah, and typically, in some cases we would hear from school districts where the administration simply were plainly either unaware or didn't care that the Minnesota Human Rights Act and the Minnesota Constitution required them to let students use essentially the bathrooms and restrooms. So, and I want to be clear about this, some students definitely, and particularly in the cases of non-binary students, some students prefer to use the single stall bathrooms, and that should absolutely be permitted and is permitted under the Constitution. But if the student wants to use the bathrooms and locker rooms that align with their gender identity, they are required to, the school is required to make that happen. The school is required to permit that. So in some cases, yes, it was that, there was total disregard for the law. A student would come in and say, please use my correct name. These are my pronouns, please ensure that the teachers are using the correct pronouns and know the correct pronouns and the correct name. And, make sure that I can access this bathroom or this locker room. In some cases, the schools would totally ignore that, but the vast majority had a kind of subtly different problem. And that is that the students would be formally permitted to use the bathroom or locker room that aligned with their gender identity, but it was not safe for them to do so. And in many of these cases, we heard really sobering accounts of bullying that happened in bathrooms. Typically, including things like students trying to break into the stall, students trying to, find out what genitals somebody had, students trying to block access to the bathroom or locker room, and then outside of that bathroom and locker room setting, just like in general, name calling, poor treatment, passing around photos of you know, what the child looked like before they started to socially transition and things like that, and just using the, like, refusing to use the correct pronouns and things like that. And so what the school districts would then say in these situations is they'd say, well, you absolutely, you know, you are permitted to use this bathroom that aligns with your gender identity, but wouldn't you be safer in the single stall bathroom? How about we have you use the single stall bathroom because we can't guarantee your safety in the bathroom that aligns with your gender identity. And from gender justice's perspective, this is simply not an acceptable solution. And in many cases, in almost every case that called us in, the ultimate solution to this problem of the student is not safe using the correct bathrooms and the correct locker rooms is that the student who was being bullied, the student who was being harassed, ended up leaving the school and doing school online. And this seems to be a really common solution to the problem, I'm sure, from administrators' perspectives. And this, it's not that they would be forced by the administration into doing online school. It was that, you know, after the frustration of trying to get the administration to do something about the bullying, parents, families, kids just gave up. They're like, you know, the school district can't keep me safe. They won't keep me safe. The best thing, like, it is an inferior solution from an educational perspective, but from, you know, a am I gonna be safe perspective, it's this, I, you know, gotta do online school. And then of course, in many instances, they lose access to like the whole range of like clubs, after school activities, et cetera. The other students who are supportive, and, you know, just obviously, I mean, you know, we've all been through a forced experiment in the effectiveness of online school versus in-person school. And that's certainly not the same for every student. I would never say that, but for the majority of students, clearly being in a physical classroom is superior from an educational point of view. And so what are the schools supposed to do to prevent bullying? And this is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, including in the context, like I mentioned earlier, I have a case involving sexual assault on a college campus. And so I think a lot about Title IX and the Minnesota Human Rights Act and how they're supposed to work in this context. And I brought cases under both Title IX and the Minnesota Human Rights Act in agencies. So for Title IX, the relevant agency is the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. They do an investigation, they do mediation following that investigation. For the Minnesota Human Rights Act, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights investigates those cases, and they issue then a probable cause finding if they find there's probable cause of discrimination. And yeah, and then I've taken both kinds of cases to court. One, you know, cases that I'm actively litigating now, as well as cases in the past. And from my perspective, one of the reasons why this doesn't get addressed in schools is that Title IX is extremely difficult to enforce because of legal precedents. And as a law nerd, I could go into great detail about the flaws in the way that Title IX is written and that US Supreme Court precedent has interpreted Title IX. But many of these issues are really turn on very technical issues of language and constitutional power and things like that, rather than on, you know, what's best for schools, what's best for students. I mean, primarily because the United States Congress simply doesn't have as much authority over schools as states do over their own schools from a constitutional perspective. And so the statute is written in such a way that it is just challenging to enforce. It's challenging for private parties to enforce. If you have to rely on the agency and you can't really effectively sue, it's just, I mean, I often like to say that if a civil right is not enforceable, it doesn't really exist. So, and that's my perspective in part on Title IX. And when it comes to things like sexual assault on campus, Title IX gets a really bad rap from some quarters for various different reasons. But one of the things that you often hear when it comes to Title IX is, well, why are schools adjudicating sexual assault? Shouldn't the police be doing that? And from my perspective, the vast majority of cases, you do not want the police adjudicating them. You do not want the consequence to be going to prison, loss of liberty for the, I think one of the things that I struggle with, and I'm not quite sure how to articulate here, I'm pausing a little bit and thinking very carefully and thinking about how I want to choose my words, because obviously preventing sexual violence is critical. But if the only tool is prison, the vast majority of sexual violence will go unaddressed. So, and I like to think of Title IX and why are schools involved in adjudicating sexual assault and compare it to Title VII. So for those of you familiar with civil rights laws, you're probably aware that Title VII is the federal law that prohibits discrimination in employment. This is where sexual harassment law, well, it's part of where sexual harassment law comes from. It's complicated. I'm not going to get all the way into it. And in the context of employment, it is very clear to people that if you require somebody to work at a job where they are being sexually harassed, that is a form of discrimination, and that they need to be free to work in an environment without sexual harassment. And it is precisely the same thing when it comes to education. Now, the kind of critical difference when it comes to education is that all students have a right to an education. Students have a right to an education under the Minnesota Constitution. Students have a right to an education because of federal precedents as well. And so you can't simply, it's not equivalent to like at-will employment in the workplace. What happens in the workplace is a lot of times, you know, a company will do an informal investigation. They'll hire a law firm to come in and investigate and see, okay, did sexual harassment really occur? And if it did, you know, what are the disciplinary consequences, including, you know, maybe a suspension, maybe some training, or maybe termination, maybe being fired. And when it comes to disciplining a student in school who is perpetrating sexual violence, their rights need to be taken, their right to an education needs to be taken extremely seriously. And there needs to be some form of process beyond just like a really informal, like, I talked to Sue, and Sue said she saw it, and there, we're done, you're fired. And going through the process of investigating and adjudicating these things is really challenging in a way that takes care of everybody's rights. But again, I want to point you back to the scenarios that we were looking at earlier, which is that if schools don't do anything, then the person who is experiencing the violence is deprived of their education. If they are required to attend class with somebody who is continuing to bully them and not being prevented from bullying them, they do not have access to an equal education. And schools need to be much more proactive in addressing bullying, and they need to take steps short of expulsion. Because another of the things that I have learned from doing this is that if you have only two alternatives, exoneration or expulsion, for the students who are perpetrating the bullying, the sexual violence, etc., then the system will work really hard to exonerate them. And you need a wider range of tools to address the bullying than just those two outcomes. But you can't do nothing. And you can't put the burden on the person who is being bullied and no burden on the student who is doing the bullying. Yeah, so this is a huge problem in a number of different dimensions in Minnesota schools. But obviously one of the things that we're seeing coming up a lot right now is particularly for transgender students. And whenever, in the news, this becomes really salient, incidences of bullying go up, right? Because students hear, maybe they hear parents or they hear the news discussing this issue or something like that, or they hear somebody else say something about the issue and they, just become reactive to it in a way that they might not have noticed otherwise. Excuse me. And so one of the most concerning things kind of going around various state legislature these days are bans on gender affirming care and bans on talking about sexual orientation and gender identity in schools. This is clearly like the prior to the NH versus Anoka Hennepin case. I'm sure many of you are aware of a previous case involving Anoka Hennepin when they had a similar policy that was essentially, don't talk about sexual orientation at school. And there was a rash of suicides prompted by bullying of people who either were students who were LGBTQ or who were perceived as being LGBTQ. And that same dynamic plays out. If everybody's scared to say anything about sexual orientation, it's really challenging to address the bullying. And so, yeah. One of the things that I wanted to do is kind of make you all aware of what's going on, and probably some of you have heard of it and some of you have not. But a lot of times, so education that is attacking transgender students is proposed in the legislature. Sometimes it passes, sometimes it gets signed into law, and then frequently it gets stopped by litigation. There are precedents, the Supreme Court has said that discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity is a form of sex discrimination. The current Office for Civil Rights says the same thing as well, with respect to healthcare, with respect to education, with respect to employment and all sorts of things. But recently, the state of Alabama passed a ban on gender affirming care for anybody younger than 19. And again, in most cases, what you're talking about is for gender affirming healthcare, is you're usually talking about therapy when you're talking about kids. And you're usually talking about therapy that allows them to explore their identity in a safe way and that is affirming. And that, so in that case, you know, I don't actually know who brought the litigation, but some entity, some individual sued Alabama and asked the courts, a federal court, to put in place an injunction preventing that law. And the injunction did not come. There was a hearing on it last Friday. The law went into effect on Sunday without an injunction being put in place. And it's really important to, you know, students read about these, even if they're not in Alabama, they become afraid, they become frightened about what could happen to them. They become upset about what is happening to people like them in that state. And it just has a big negative impact. It also has a negative impact in terms of, you know, people who are then trying to push back on the entire concept of gender identity. So that's something that I wanted to call out. I mean, obviously, there is so much going on in the news right now in terms of the Supreme Court that I don't know that this has gotten a lot of attention, but it is concerning that, you know, not only are these laws being passed, but they are being, in some cases, permitted to go into effect. So, and that's something that Minnesota certainly is not immune to. So if you look at the state legislature, a number of bills along these lines have been introduced, and they haven't, you know, been enacted because they haven't passed, you know, both houses of the legislature and been signed by the governor. The governor has, you know, indicated that he would not sign any such legislation, but that doesn't mean that it's not being proposed here and not being taken seriously by a whole lot of folks. So, yeah, I think, and I wanted to talk next about some resources that are available. So again, you know, one of the things that you can do if you are looking for more information about this, or if you are looking to advocate for a student or something like that, is, you know, they can contact us. And as I mentioned, so Gender Justice, and let me put our website. It's genderjustice.us. And actually, I'm totally not prepared with the link to the correct page, but I'm going to try and find it right now really quickly. We also have get legal assistance. I'm going to try and link the precise. Page.
Well, Christy gathers that link. I also just want to encourage folks, if you have questions, you can go ahead and type them in the chat and we'll collect those. I know I've been writing down some questions for you as we go. This has been so great. Thank you, Christy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a page that talks about our victory in the NH versus Anoka Hennepin case. And, you know, as we were headed back to school this past fall, it includes some links for people to advocate for themselves, including a Know Your Rights handout, an advocacy letter that families can use to advocate for their students, or that students can use to advocate for themselves. So those tools are available on Gender Justice website. And then there are a number of different organizations that support transgender families. And I'm just going to link right here. So Transforming Families Minnesota is an excellent organization that we do a lot of work with gender justice. And they have, this is, I linked you to news, but they have a resources page, resources tab at the top there too, that has a whole boatload of things like, what are some camps that offer support for LGBTQ youth and families? What are some crisis resources? What are some ways that people can educate themselves, or where can people get health care, and things like that. So it's just a really, and because it's local, a lot of these organizations that are linked to, the resources that are linked to, are local. Transforming Families also does has groups directly with families and students. They are welcoming to all. So, I mean, I think one of the things that I think is very true about this next generation and like the middle schoolers that I interact with these days is that many of them are experimenting with the idea of what some people immediately know, I am transgender. Some students are experimenting with, what is my gender identity? What is my gender expression? What do I want to do? How do I want to present myself to the world? What pronouns would I like people to use to call me with? Transforming Families is very supportive of that. All kinds of, I love the term that they use, gender creative, all gender creative kids. And they offer, support groups for parents, education for parents, as well as ways for kids to connect themselves. And so I think that's a really, really useful resources for trans students and their families. And I think one of the good pieces of news, so we've presented some doom and gloom about all of the bad stuff that's facing trans kids in schools. But I think one of the really positive things that we've seen from the folks that contact us is that, the vast majority, in fact, I'm trying to think of an exception and I can't, of people who contact us with these things are not alone when they contact us. They have a supportive parent, a supportive friend, a supportive educator in their life, somebody who is helping them advocate for themselves, and that is extremely critical. So, and good news that, that people are finding support. And I've managed to now not see the chat. Oh, there we go. Close the chat. Yes, I did. I was a computer scientist before being a lawyer. That doesn't mean that I'm always great at all aspects of technology. But so I would love to hear questions and answer questions if anybody has any.
Oh, I got questions. This has been an absolutely amazing presentation, Christy. Thank you so much. There's a lot that's going through my mind. I mean, I'm thinking about when you were talking about how the alternative for students has ended up being students going online. And, I'm sure most of us are aware that the Sexual Assault Awareness Month happened last month, and that was highlighting online abuse and online harassment and violence. And I'm just thinking about, there's some research that's suggesting from GLSEN that LGBT students experience much higher rates of online harassment. And so it's like, moving from one form to another. And I'll be interested to see the results of the Minnesota Student Survey on this particular subject, especially to see how COVID has impacted that. So I don't know, that's just me, I think, processing that piece of information and thinking about how, like, wow, that really is not a solution. So my question for you is, coming at this from a primary prevention standpoint, I'm wondering about the schools that are like really doing it right. I'm wondering about like, what are some of the like features of those communities that have like a really good culture And specifically what I'm curious about is if there are like model policies that schools can implement, or if you know of places where people, maybe in their own communities could go to find a model policy to maybe advocate for in their community to try to stop this stuff from happening in the first place. So that's my first question.
Yeah, so and the Transforming Families website that I linked, I'm gonna do the actual resource page this time. If you go to the resource page right there, they list an organization called Gender Inclusive Schools. And they advocate for gender inclusive policies and practices. There's also, I'm totally blanking. This is a project of a human rights campaign, welcoming schools, and they do. I think they have some model policies on their site. One of the lessons actually, and again, why I think it's interesting to link these things, is that there has been more research on how to create a welcoming workplace, I think, than there has been on how to create a welcoming school environment. Again, in part because of the enforceability of the civil rights laws behind them. Though actually I bring up, Minnesota Human Rights Act, one of my projects over the past several years and continuing into the next few years is to turn the Minnesota Human Rights Act into a tool for enforcing civil rights in schools as opposed to Title IX. So anyway, sorry, that was a totally random diversion. But one of the things that we know from workplaces about creating a welcoming environment is that it comes from the top. It has to be clear that the powers that be care about this issue and that there are consequences. If people do not behave in welcoming ways, it will be addressed. It doesn't say what those consequences have to be necessarily, but that, there's, from the powers that be, there is no tolerance for this kind of behavior. And that, what research shows is that inhibits people who would otherwise potentially, harass others. They see, oh, I'm probably not going to get away with this. I'm probably going to be in big trouble if I do this. Maybe I won't. And that, the people who are raising complaints will be supported. One of the, and I'm going to tell you about this, and I can tell you about it because I did not have to sign a confidentiality agreement, which I love and appreciate so much. So a few years back, I sued St. Olaf because of a sexual assault that happened on their campus. I was representing a student who was sexually assaulted at St. Olaf. And and this student advocated for herself very forcefully. You can look up the article in the Star Tribune about her advocacy for herself and that kind of thing. It's just an amazing client. And in most cases, what happens when I sue somebody is they get extremely defensive. They go into litigation defense mode and they're like, we did nothing wrong. We followed the law. What are you talking about? And what St. Olaf did instead is, and I'm not going to pretend that they're perfect. I'm sure they're not perfect. Nobody's perfect. But I just really appreciated this experience that I had. Is they brought in, folks to help them fix the problem in ways that were probably counterproductive to defending themselves in litigation had it proceeded to litigation. In one of the things that they did is that they allowed people to come in and make a complaint and then decide whether they wanted that complaint to be pursued or not. And if the complaint was serious enough, like, that there was a threat to, safety or whatever, the school would say, I'm sorry, we have to do something about this. But in the vast majority of cases where students came in to complain about sexual assault, they did not want to pursue any kind of formal action. They just wanted to be heard, and they wanted to be able to access resources to help them with it. And they wanted to be believed and trusted by their institution. And so they gave, the complainants who are coming in the power essentially to say what they wanted to have happen next. And then they kind of like iterated on that complaint process. So they would regularly try and figure out what are the barriers to people coming to complain. Why is somebody not telling us when this happens? And in fact, if you look, and I haven't looked lately, I don't know what COVID has done to this whole situation. I haven't looked lately, but one of the things that you'll notice about St. Olaf actually is that the number of sexual assaults reported is almost as high as the University of Minnesota's. And that sounds terrifying, but it is actually good. Because they have made it safe for people to come and complain to them. And expulsion is not the outcome in the vast majority of these cases. There are a range of different tools that they use, including requiring people to, seek some education and things like that, or and I could go on and on about this experience. And, so we were sitting in a mediation about this, and they were explaining the things that they had done. And my client was so pleased, and at the same time, she experienced harm because they didn't do right when she was there. And so they also agreed to compensate her financially. So and it was just kind of one of the most outlier litigation experiences I've ever had. But I like to talk to people about it. And and she said, I'm not going to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and they didn't make her. So there you go. Anyway, sorry, that was a whole long train of that went there. Thanks for the link in the chat to the Minnesota Human Rights Act. Somebody also mentioned earlier, it looks like Marissa mentioned the Minnesota Department of Education created a toolkit earlier. Yes, so this is a useful, and this is prior to the NH versus Anoka decision. It's also prior to, some US Supreme Court and other federal decisions that happened. So it is framed in the this is a good idea rather than this is required by law. One of the things that we have advocated for at Gender Justice is to update the toolkit, but that is a great resource as well. Anybody else have any questions or comments?
I am just reflecting, I took so many notes as you were talking about all these things I'm going to follow up on afterwards. One of the big things that stood out to me, and I think that comes up regularly in these meetings when we have these conversations, is the importance of starting prevention early. And just as you're saying, right, this is happening in middle schools, and middle schools aren't necessarily prepared. And it's so important that all of our sexual violence prevention education is getting started in middle school and earlier if we're really thinking about how to prevent. So I just wanted to pull out, that's one of my takeaways today, is thinking about working with schools, working with students, and thinking about really starting early. But I'm also reflecting on the story you just told about St. Olaf and working with colleges and universities. And I know we have a lot of folks on our network. We have some folks who are in a Title IX coordinator role. They work in the Title IX office. That's their their role is about Title IX. I'm curious what you might recommend for those folks who are interested in learning more about how they can incorporate the Minnesota Human Rights Act into their office and thinking about their role more broadly. I guess I'm curious. This is a lot of new information for me. I often think of Title IX, and now I'm curious, where have I been missing these connections to the Minnesota Human Rights Act?
Yeah, so and one of the challenges I think is complying with Title IX in a way that the Department of Education is going to find acceptable. And also doing the right thing. So I mean, one example, I mean, when you go back to the St. Olaf example, it is a huge no-no to let the student decide whether they want to. Like in most cases, if a student reports to anybody on campus for litigation reasons, the professor has to call up the Title IX office and tell them, and the Title IX office has to take some action. And that's for litigation defense is the reason why that happens. Because there's a notice requirement in the case law around Title IX. And obviously under Betsy DeVos as well, there were new regulations issued under Title IX that created like what was a safe haven process involving adjudication for these kinds of cases, and that introduced a whole lot of like legal procedural aspects into the process, some of which are helpful and some of which are decidedly not. And also, created huge loopholes in liability so that it's extremely difficult to enforce. So, yeah, and I think, I don't know, I come from this, I come from this in a like totally backwards way because I'm suing people all the time. But like, I see the challenges in enforcing Title IX then like playing out in how this gets done on campus, because the primary goal of Title IX coordinators, I mean, of schools who employ Title IX coordinators, not of the Title IX coordinators themselves, but of the schools, is to protect themselves from legal liability by putting in place a process. And I think so. And the thing that schools fear is occasionally that they'll be sued by a student. But I mean, the Supreme Court actually just the week before last eliminated the ability to seek damages in cases under these kinds of certain kinds of damages in private lawsuits brought under Title IX and analogous civil rights statutes that turn on federal funding. I don't know, it's really nerdy, really complicated. But this again just introduces another barrier to enforcement of Title IX. I think, one of the things that like the enforceability of the law does is in some cases it does just bring about this like really litigation defense thing. But if you have really effective enforcement, what you get is people who are actually like motivated to try to solve the problem at the root. And so you get, interesting experiments and, people really trying to figure this out and people trying to figure out how to make a welcoming workplace and things like that. Insurance companies requiring you to create a welcoming workplace before they will insure you, all of those kinds of things. But I guess what that means from my perspective is that not that thinking about the law from a Minnesota Human Rights Act perspective is going to help the Title IX coordinators or people who are working on this problem, but that if this were actually enforceable, it would create motivations to do the right thing. So, my aim in bringing cases under the Minnesota Human Rights Act is to scare people into doing the right thing. So that doesn't really answer your question, but.
No, I appreciate that. I think this is a big topic of conversation, something that we could maybe talk about further as well. And I'll be curious to continue these conversations with the folks here in the room with us and others as we share this information. And please continue to share questions in the chat if you have them. But I just want to say thank you so much, Christy, for coming and sharing all of this knowledge with us. I know I learned so much, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join us here today. And I'll do my virtual applause.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you all.
Okay, well, I will continue looking out for questions, or you can also raise your hand if you'd like to unmute and ask a question to Christy. But I also want to open up the floor for announcements. We always want to have some time in these meetings to invite folks to share what's going on. If there's events or new resources that are happening that you'd like to share with other preventionists here with us today. We already have some really great resources that Christy has shared with us, and I will gather those and we'll share those back out with everyone after the meeting today. But I also want to open it up for other announcements. So I'm going to start us off with an announcement that's actually from MNCASA. And Hunter, feel free to join in if you'd like, but I can present as well if you'd like about the RFP and a really exciting funding opportunity that MNCASA has right now.
Yeah, Mary, I can definitely take over. Thanks so much. I wanted to open it up to the floor to see if anyone wanted to join, but good afternoon, everyone. This is Hunter Beckstrom with the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Some folks might be familiar that we actually have a new request for proposal for our Community Prevention Partnerships Program, and that actually offers two culturally responsive or culturally specific organizations that work in the community that would actually offer those folks $225,000 over the span of 3 years. So being $75,000 a year to do both primary prevention strategies intersected with anti-oppression work together. And so just this past Monday, we did do a lunch and learn session on that, and that was recorded. So if anyone is interested in any of the details or actually receiving the request for proposal, please reach out to myself. I'll throw in my email in the chat, but I also know that this is accessible via the SVPN newsletter as well. And I'll also put the link to the RFP in the chat. So thanks so much for allowing me that space, Mary. And I should just jump in really briefly. I forgot to mention that the proposals are due on Wednesday, May 25th, just so folks know that as well. Thank you.
There's also another exciting event coming up next week. The Office on Justice Programs has their annual conference on crime and victimization coming up. It is over the span of 2 weeks, and there's a bunch of really great virtual presentations that you can opt in to participate in over the next 2 weeks. And there's a few with a great focus on prevention. So we always find it valuable to participate in that conference whenever we can. So also encourage you all to check that out.
I'd also just like to give a shout out to the SVPN newsletter and pop the link to learn more about SVPN and sign on to the newsletter if you're not on there. And just let you know that if you hear of news in the field, or if you do have events or other things that you'd like to promote and uplift in the newsletter, you can definitely send them my way. I'll put my email in the chat for you to do just that. And I'm not seeing any other announcements or questions. And so I just want to say I mean, first of all, once again, thank you so much, Christy. My brain is just sparking all over the place from this amazing presentation. I'd love another round of virtual applause for Christy if we could get one. And I want to also thank all of you who joined us today for this meeting of the Sexual Violence Prevention Network. Really hope that you enjoyed this meeting, and we would just love for you to take a couple of minutes to complete the evaluation form that Marissa just posted in the chat to tell us what you thought. We are always looking to improve those meetings, and we want to hear what you think. And especially any of you who are potentially looking for continuing education credits, we've included a new question in our evaluation to figure out what kinds of continuing education credits it might be helpful for us to potentially apply for in the future. So please definitely fill that out. Thank you all so much, and we will see you next time.